History in any country is a form of capital. It's a resource that governments, that political movements, academics all want to monopolize. And I think that's especially true in India, a relatively new nation that's been created out of one of the only civilizations where all the world's 4 great religions have at different times ruled and collided. Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Christianity. The competition amongst believers to control history struck me constantly as I traveled across India working on my book. And perhaps nowhere more vividly so than in an obscure, sleepy village in central India. In that village, Sanati, there's a tiny temple that's dedicated to a Hindu goddess, Kalikamba. And some years ago, a huge storm smashed the roof over her head. When the workers cleared the rubble, they flipped over the altar stone. Its center had been smashed out in order to hold the square pedestal where the goddess stood. On the underside were inscriptions in the ancient Brahmi script, 2 rock edicts of the 3rd century emperor Ashoka, the famous follower of the Buddha who ruled over much of India. In later centuries, Brahmin priests had literally overturned the earlier history, repurposing Ashoka's stone as the base for their own deity. Ashoka's message in these inscriptions, well, it was an eloquent call for respecting those whose beliefs are different from your own. So even if Ashoka might not have, I think at least we can appreciate the irony. It's long frustrated me how the richness of Indian history gets flattened by and subordinated to collective belief, whether it's religious or ideological, as happened first with colonialism and later with nationalism. Myth and legend replace context and history. Complex individuals are reborn as cartoon characters or even comic heroes. And it's become harder to grasp really how contemporary India came to be, one of the world's most inventive democratic experiments, and also emerging now as an economic dynamo. So over the years, I've started thinking about how a fresh approach to explaining Indian history and to telling the fascinating stories of the men and women who made that history can be worked out. I wanted to tell those stories in a form that was both nuanced and rigorous in its scholarship, but also humanly compelling, perhaps even inspiring. Because I think Indian collisions between multiple beliefs and traditions have brought forth some of human history's actually most interesting social, philosophical, and practical innovators. Gandhi with his creative nonviolence, just to name one. And it seemed to me that the ideas of other of our thinkers, people like Periyar or Amrita Shergill or Ambedkar, to name 3 who figure in my book, that those figures and those ideas are too important to be buried in scholasticism, because they have a lot to contribute to some of the urgent, entrenched problems, not just in India today, but indeed in the world at large. And that's what led me to embark on a very long journey through Indian cities and villages that became my book, Incarnations. It's a book that, starting with the Buddha, traces about 2,500 years of Indian history through 50 remarkable lives. Scientists, philosophers, kings, artists, poets, photographers, freedom fighters, industrialists, musicians, mathematicians, all of these figure in the book. A 2nd century healer whose lessons on Ayurveda are still used to treat conditions from infertility to diabetes around the world. A baby-faced monk, Vivekananda, who effectively founded yoga while living actually here in Manhattan in the 1890s. Some of the names in my book are well known, but I think they are still misunderstood, including, for instance, Vivekananda, who was a perceptive critic of many aspects of Hinduism, but has lately been turned into a kind of mascot of the Hindu right Some, like, beg your pardon, some, like a man called Pillay, the plucky South Indian freedom fighter who decided to take the British Empire's shipping might on, are really very little known at all. And nearly all of the stories I tell in the book, I think, shine a light on conflicts that are still wrenching India today. To tell these stories accurately, I explored important new scholarship. So archaeological discoveries, advances in our understandings of Sanskrit science and also philosophy, newly recovered documents. That's a page from the mathematician Ramanujan's, what was known as his lost notebook, and also declassified files about the modern era. I drew upon all of these sources, not just to bring precision to historical biography, but in order to puncture some of the stereotypes that are held about India. Stereotypes that reign not just in the minds of Westerners, but actually in the minds of Indians too. In short, India is, I think, simply too important to the world to be so simplistically understood. And so I decided to demythologize Indian history a bit in order to rehumanize it. Let's start with the first real individual that we can find in Indian history. Siddhartha Gautama, who became known as the Buddha. We think of him primarily as a beatific spiritual master, right? An icon whose teachings are now followed by more than 1 million people across the world, 1 billion people across the world, were chiefly concerned with transcending the world of material attachments. But in the North India, where he was born around the 5th century BC, he was also a political radical. He was envisaging a society that was so threatening to the established order that even as his teachings spread across Asia and other parts of the world, they were virtually obliterated in the country of his birth. Born to privilege, the Buddha undertook the great renunciation that's common to many Indian stories in order to find enlightenment. But in achieving it, he laid out both spiritual practices and also revolutionary social ones. He and his followers, for instance, rejected the caste order, the rigid caste order upheld by Brahmins, and they enacted a series of unorthodox ideas for their time about the inclusion of women in worship, about the idea of shared property and collective decision-making, and about the expansion of literacy to people of lower castes, something that the Brahminic order forbade. He was, in other words, a threat to reigning power structures. And so as Buddhism flourished in Tibet, in Japan, in China, and Indonesia, it was stamped out, sometimes violently, in his Indian homelands by both Hindu and then Muslim regimes. Which makes it even more striking that after this long historical suppression, the Buddha erupts back into Indian history in the 20th century through the imaginative struggles of another misunderstood genius whom I write about, and that's B.R. Ambedkar. He's the one in the blue suit there, which he made fashionable across India. Ambedkar was born an untouchable. He was educated in large part in this city at Columbia University. He was one of the architects of the Indian Constitution. And he turned ultimately to the Buddha as an example of worldly liberation from oppression. Ambedkar's unexpected political incarnation of the Buddha has made that ancient teacher today an icon in the struggle against the caste system. Take it from Vijay, a young friend I met in the slum lanes in the course of my research. His family comes from a historically despised Dalit caste, known as the Untouchables in former times. But as Vijay explained to me, and these are his words, the Buddha had no caste, and so I have no caste. Buddha to Vijay represents caste equality. So this is how the Buddha has returned to contemporary Indian life, not as a remote spiritual figure offering enlightenment, but as a crucial guiding everyday historical presence, with a liberating message for tens of millions of stigmatized Indians and for the nation as a whole. Here's another stereotype of India, that it's a land of mystical traditions, remote from steely analytical thought. Well, when I was in Mysore in South India, I got to hold in my hands a text from before the Common Era that contradicts that view. Inscribed on palm leaves, the manuscript was rediscovered at the beginning of the 20th century. And it proved that Indian thinking had, in the person of a man called Kautilya, a political mind that made Machiavelli, who lived some 1,500 years later, look gentle as a lamb. 2 millennia, virtually, ago, Kautilya was counseling kings in the treacherous arts of what today we would call disinformation, surveillance, and covert ops. Here's but one sentence in this unnervingly ruthless strategic work. Kautilya writes, "An arrow unleashed by an archer may kill a single man, or not kill anyone. But a strategy unleashed by a wise man kills even those still in the womb." There's nothing mystical about Kautilya. Rather, he advocates guile, cunning, and deceit as essential to maintaining power. And today, his cutthroat advice has become a guide to corporate success in a competitive economy. His Baudelaire's work is now a manual for aspiring entrepreneurs all over India. Indeed, I'm told that the Pakistani army even prescribes Kautilya to their trainee officers as a way of gaining insight into the devious Indian mind. Yet not many outside of India have heard of Kautilya. And even in India, few really study him. And so a significant strain of Indian political philosophy, not to mention a really good read, is exiled from its rightful position of being, I think, an international classic of political thought. Focusing, as tends to happen, on the Indian growth story, we risk, I think, losing the backstory. A story that goes some way to explain India's current economic surge. Take Indian scientific rigor. As my book shows, it wasn't born yesterday. But the legendary figure of Panini, perhaps the greatest ever logician of how language works, is hardly known beyond a few Sanskrit scholars. Google his name and you'll get advice on Italian sandwiches. Now, Panini lived sometime in the 4th century BC, in the very northwest of India, what today would be Afghanistan. All we have of him is a Sanskrit text. It's known as the Ashtadhyayi, which means the 8 chapters. And it was written down long after he lived. Briefly, and without going into the details, Panini produced in this text what's known as a generative grammar. He identified and formalized the rules that describe not just all the existing features of Sanskrit usage, but were capable of generating a virtually an infinite number of grammatically correct statements. All current Sanskrit utterances, as well as any possible future Sanskrit sentences, could be derived from his rules, from his system. And he expressed these rules with extraordinary concision through sutras or verses in the form of code. To give you an idea of the compression he achieved, an English translation of Panini's work runs to about 1,300 pages. His Sanskrit text is just 40 pages. And his work remains still one of the most remarkable analyses of language ever produced. Even contemporary linguistic theorists like Noam Chomsky regard him with awe. And some indeed see a relationship between Panini's analysis and modern IT programming. Some argue that Panini invented an early type of algorithmic system. And I think it's not entirely far-fetched to see a link between an ability to grasp Sanskrit's architecture and skill in the languages of modern computer programming. Another theme that runs through my book is, I think, relevant to attempts these days in India to stifle free expression. Libraries have been burned over history that's been deemed offensive, books have been pulped, scholars have been harassed. As many of the stories I set out to make clear in my book, what's driven India forward and made it stronger and less oppressive historically has been the spirit of dissent. Rabble-rousers and critics who bravely took on their society and its customs contributed, I think, far more than we sometimes acknowledge to India's contemporary incarnation as a global power. And they've helped to drive significant social change, too. Take, for instance, the systematic oppressions and often outright crimes that are committed against Indian women. While they're a completely legitimate cause for despair, it's also important to note that conditions aren't uniformly dismal across the country. In the more progressive South, for instance, child marriage and fertility rates are far lower than in North India, and female literacy and employment rates are much higher. Now, to point out this divergence isn't to suggest that there's some fundamental cultural difference between North and South. It's to recognize that inroads have been made by reform movements, among them one led by a school dropout from the South, a Tamil leader known as Periyar. With his wild beard, he looks to me a bit like a beat poet, down to the little dog he kept beside him. He did that because he wanted to scare off Brahmins. He was also an atheist and a rationalist, beliefs that can get you killed in India today. And from the 1920s to the 1970s, Periyar waged an intellectual campaign against upper caste northerners who he believed were dominating the national movement. Setting himself up as the anti-Gandhi to counter Gandhi's habit of dressing white, Periyar always wore black. One of the things he pressed for was equality and greater freedom for women. So for almost half a century, he advocated women's rights and unhindered access, for instance, to contraception in blunt fighting prose. And here's an example from one of his newspapers. He writes, "Have cats ever freed rats? Have foxes ever liberated goats or chickens? Have whites ever enriched Indians? Have Brahmins ever given non-Brahmins justice? We can be confident that women will never be emancipated by men." Women, he would say again and again in his speeches and his writings, had to free themselves through their own personal and political action. And as I traced the rise and career of this whip-tongued reformer and the careers of many of the other social disruptors that I write about, I was struck repeatedly by a simple historical truth of how, under sustained and creative criticism, even the most rigid societies can change. Of course, the most eccentric and celebrated Indian reformer of modern times was Gandhi. Now, Mahatma Gandhi is often portrayed as a spiritual paragon, someone who transcends his historical moment. But in the story I tell of his surprising rise to power, I hope to get you to see him with a bit more nuance, as an individual whose flaws and eccentricities were matched by some really very modern strategic gifts. For one, he was a brilliant maker and exploiter of mass media images, someone I think who could have taught Steve Jobs a thing or two about branding. Gandhi's most famous act of nonviolent resistance was the Salt Satyagraha of 1930. It was a 200-mile protest march from his ashram to the sea in Western India. And its nominal goal was to pick up a handful of salt from the seashore, defying what many considered an unfair British tax on an essential household good. Gandhi's idea to make salt the symbol of British oppression came to him, he later said, in a flash of inspiration, his inner voice speaking to him. But in fact, he planned and managed the march's execution with uncanny grasp of the media as a political tool. The 79 marchers who accompanied him, well, each one was chosen and vetted by Gandhi himself. No political colleagues were invited, lest they distract attention that should be centered on Gandhi. The marchers' outfits, Gandhi designed them. No political insignia were allowed, in order to make sure that the procession conveyed a timeless, universal quality. He alone was allowed to carry a stick, ensuring his leadership would stand out. And the finishing touch was to dispatch an advance crew of his followers to whip up excitement in the villages he was going to be walking through, so that the crowds were kind of out there waiting for him as he came through, followed by the motor brigades of camera crews. And those camera crews from around the world, well, needless to say, Gandhi had invited them too. And so the jiggly footage of the Mahatma striding across the dusty plains, leading his band of followers, was imprinted on the imaginations of people across the world. The tiny stick man with teapot ears showing up the imperial blimps. Some months later, Time magazine would draw him for their cover, a cover in which he's shown studying a newspaper, reading perhaps of his own success at managing the media around the world. Now, to see Gandhi as the strategist he was is not, of course, to diminish him. It's to bring to life a leader who I think ranks beside a small handful of contemporaries who remade the modern world. But unlike a Stalin or a Hitler or a Mao, Gandhi won power through nonviolence, and his goals were obviously infinitely different. And they required, as I tell in my essay on him in my book, real grit and nerve to achieve. Of all the stereotypes that Indians trade in when considering historical figures, some of the most damaging, I think, relate to women. Given the deep roots in India of patriarchy, there are many fewer historical records for significant females than there are for their male counterparts. And that absence of sources plays into an absurd cultural tendency, which is to turn real women of intellection, fallibility, and bravery into goddess-type figures, figures that can be worshipped by women today, but not emulated. Consider Lakshmi Bai, the Rani or the Queen of Jhansi, who resisted British rule during the uprising of 1857. This Jezebel Rani, as the British termed her, would be commemorated in countless Western adventure and romance novels as a tempestuous villainess. Meanwhile, Indians know her as a heroine frozen in a single dramatic image, astride a horse, sword raised, her adopted son clinging to her back. The British are about to conquer her fort, but instead of surrendering, she's making a bold midnight escape over the ramparts. That's a sign at her fort in Jhansi. As I looked down from the fort walls she supposedly leapt over, only one word came to my mind, which was splat. Yet she's been stuck in a militant flying goddess version of history that, like the Western Jezebel tales, leave little room for the actual earthbound queen that she was. A woman struggling to gain and rule over a kingdom that the British were trying to grab for themselves. So it's a relief to be able to gain a more intimate sense of her from contemporary sources, which only recently have been translated in full. It turns out she was strong of mind and body. Weightlifting, wrestling, and steeplechase were just her pre-breakfast routine. She was indifferent to regal trappings, unlike her cross-dressing husband. And she was such a hands-on ruler that she punished criminals herself with the whack of a stick. Under pressure from the British, as I tell in my book, the anxious queen decided that rebels marching from the north might help her to hold on to her kingdom, a decision with tragic results to both sides, as it turned out. As I narrate the story of a woman ruler who took on the British and was killed by them, a further goal of mine, therefore, is to restore to the Indian past something that it's decidedly short on. That is, sophisticated, judgment-making female leaders, real individuals grappling with difficult conditions that today's young people might actually engage with. Another pernicious stereotype that traps the Indian imagination concerns race. And it's a subject that I explore in my essay on an astoundingly resourceful Ethiopian teenager who was shipped to India as a slave and who rose to become a power broker in the Deccan plains of central India. Malik Amber, you probably haven't heard his name, because he's one of those remarkable historical figures who gets excluded from the Indian pantheon, since they don't fall into any of the standard narrative silos of Indian history, Hindu, Muslim, or European. Traveling across India, working on my book, I heard many young Indians extol the bravery of Shivaji, a 17th century Hindu warrior who defied the Mughals and serves today as a symbol of Hindu pride and resistance. But when I mentioned Malik Amber to them, who beat back Mughal expansion before Shivaji, eyes would go blank. And that's, I think, a real shame, because Malik Amber's story is one of genuine and really quite improbable self-making. Malik Amber was human chattel, shipped from Africa in exchange for Indian cloth, part of a thriving but now little remembered slave traffic that sailed eastwards to India, as against the more well-known pattern of slave trade from Africa west to North America. An indentured warrior, he was forced to fight for the Deccan potentates who owned him. But on the side, he quietly racked up a whole series of other non-martial skills: multiple languages, irrigation engineering, and accounting amongst them. And before long, his master recognized him not just as a great fighter, but as a brilliant strategic mind. Freed by that master on his deathbed, Malik Amber quickly amassed power of his own. Through guerrilla tactics and nighttime raids in the treacherously hilly Deccan countryside, the Ethiopian and his army of crack horsemen stopped the southward thrust of the Mughal Emperor Akbar and his son Jahangir. And ultimately, Malik Amber gained control over much of the Deccan. Indeed, he was such a nemesis to the Mughals that the Emperor Jahangir took to commissioning gruesome miniature paintings like this one here, where you can see him in which he's firing an arrow at the beheaded top of Malik Amber. It's a fantasy, though, because the Emperor Jahangir never actually captured Malik Amber. It's something that he never achieved in real life. But Jahangir might have been pleased had he foreseen the future, because that has secured the elimination of Malik Amber from Indian history. Malik Amber wasn't a Hindu native defending some ancient Hindu motherland. He was an African outsider, and he was thereby destined to be diminished in a society still deeply prejudiced against dark skin. Descendants today of African slaves live now poor and ghettoized, many of them in the western state of Gujarat. And it's maddening that children growing up in those shunned communities will find no mention, for instance, in their school books of a self-made power entrepreneur whose skin color and lineage they actually share. Occasionally in slums and village lanes, as I researched Incarnations, I overheard teenagers explaining to their friends what I was up to. And it went along the lines of, he's telling the story of how India became #1. Well, indeed, it's a habit of national histories to justify the present as the perfect and necessary outcome of all that's come before. But as I worked on this book, I was struck again and again by how many of the 50 individuals I write about posed, like Malik Amber, really sharp challenges to the Indian present. Through religious collisions and philosophical encounters and moral experiments, those individuals were part of arguments that have been kept going for millennia in India about what kind of life is worth living, what kind of society is worth having, which hierarchies are morally legitimate, what kind of love is valid, and what role religion has in the social and political order. And indeed, also questions about who owns the water and the land, and what kind of place India should be. A civilization that's been able to produce a Buddha and a Mirabai, a Phule, a Gandhi, or a Dhirubhai Ambani, that civilization is, I think, one that's open both to radical experiments with self-definition and to productive arguments about what a country and its people should value. And such diverse energy is worth celebrating, especially at a time when religious nationalists in India want to transform that multiplicity of ideas, of creative self-criticism and dissidence, into a singular ideological brew. India is one of the world's most important works in progress. And it's not just Indians, but the world at large that I think has a stake in its future, not least because nearly 1/5 of humanity lives there. Keeping that future open will need, as I hope my book shows, a much more imaginative grasp of India's richly individual past. Thank you. Great. Thanks. And I'm happy to take any questions or comments or points that you want to raise about either what I've said or what you may have read in the book, those of you who've had a chance to see it.
Oh, hi. Hi. Thanks for coming here and giving this very good talk. I was actually thinking that I would see some more mythical characters as well.
Some more?
Some mythical characters, like first one would come to my mind would be Arjuna. Like Arjun with his bow and arrow, and then that's like the quintessential warrior, right? That the biggest of the war hero. Right? That's not there. So I think it's was there a deliberate thing that you wanted to exclude the myths and only pick the characters that are more recent and you have a proof for their existence, or how did you go about like picking the characters? And I'm sure you would had a longer list, and then you kind of pruned them out at some point. And who did not make the cut, and why? Is it for that the story wasn't genuine enough, or was it that they're not that relevant to the current circumstances?
Right. No, I mean, thank you for that question, because it allows me to clarify how these 50 got into the mix. Yeah, I was really clear that I wanted to have real historical people. So not people from the epics and myths, which India is, of course, so rich in. I wanted figures who we had some historical evidence for. So figures who don't just appear in texts, but where there's actually some physical trace of their having lived. And that's why I began with the Buddha, because I think Siddhartha Gautama, who became the Buddha, is the first such figure in Indian history where he doesn't exist just in the texts about Buddha and Buddha in his teachings, but there is physical evidence of him having lived and the society in which he grew up. So I wanted to look at real history rather than the imaginative characters in the Indian past. And as you rightly say, in the epics and in some of the works of religion and philosophy, you can find some extraordinary characters who dramatize some of the fundamental moral conflicts in human life. But I couldn't find, or they didn't have enough historical evidence to say they really existed. So it's not that I'm looking just at modern figures. I mean, I go right back to 2,500 years, so it goes pretty far back. But it goes as far back as I feel we can find evidence for individuals having lived. Now, how did the others get into the selection? Well, as you've suggested, I wanted figures who did allow me to talk about some of the current day conflicts and tensions in Indian life. So whether it was caste or gender or freedom of expression or individuality, issues that are sort of running through Indian public debate today, and to try and show how there's a long history of these kinds of arguments within the Indian past. So, and I also wanted to choose figures, and this is one of the reasons why the book is called Incarnations. Figures who, in a sense, Indians still today refer to and bring to life in their own everyday struggles. And again, a very powerful example of that is the Buddha. Who, as I mentioned, is someone who the Dalits, the former untouchables in India, see as a great political inspiration to them. But it's not just the Buddha; it's many of the other figures who I talk about continue to be a source of argument over and inspiration to Indians today. So in the book, I'm constantly moving between the deep past and scholarship and evidence about that to the present and arguments about the present and indeed the use of these figures in present day debates. I did have a longer list. Initially it was about 100 figures or so. I had to cut that down. But once I'd cut it down to those 50, I didn't feel I missed the other 50. It's sort of, those were the 50 that I was happy to live with. So that was really how I got to it. But I will just say that, the 50 that I have in the book, my intention is not to create a kind of counter-pantheon or an alternative canon. It's really to invite readers into an argument about the Indian past and its future, really. It's to say, look, here are 50 figures who I think can tell us a lot, not just about Indian history, but about what India can be now. And let's debate these. Let's argue over them. You'll have your selection. You'll have figures that you would rather have in the list. But that's part of what makes Indian history so interesting. That you can go on adding to this. So I don't see the 50 as a kind of Noah's Ark where we can then sail forth with these great figures. It's really an invitation to a conversation about the Indian past and present.
So this is like a follow-up to that question. While selecting those 50 people, were you thinking to yourself that I need to be representative just because you're talking about the multiplicity of Indias? And I say Indias because there are so many different concepts for people who come from that country that they don't necessarily match if you come from a different region. So I'm especially thinking about the northeastern states who don't really find a lot of space when books about India are written. And I was looking through the list and I didn't recognize a name where I would be able to place them. I was wondering if you were thinking about being representative and also being inclusive to give a voice to some of those cultures and times that haven't really found a voice till now.
Yeah. No. Again, that's a really sharp question, and I guess there are two real regrets that I have about figures who I would have liked to have had more in the book. One is from the Northeast. That's absolutely right, and one of the problems there is that it's actually very hard to find sources for figures from earlier history of that part of the country. Particularly sources about individuals. We can find information about some of the kingdoms and other political states that rule there, but it's actually really hard to get reliable sources about individuals living there. And since that was really important to me, because I wanted to be able to have a scholarly base on which to talk about these figures, and not just to, in a sense, recycle legends or myths, that had to be a kind of, in many ways, a really painful exclusion from the kind of geography which I drew the characters from. Beyond that, I mean, I think that, you know, the figures are drawn pretty much from every other part of the country, but except for that. The other regret that I have, and in a sense, this is, I think, also a testimony to something I mentioned, the lack of sources, particularly for women in Indian history. And again, the difficulty of being able to bring to life women figures from the Indian past. There are some that we have, but what my way of dealing with that issue was to not simply to talk about issues that are relevant to women only in the essays about women. So, for instance, in the essay on Mahavir, the founder of Jainism, in the essay on Guru Nanak, the founder of Sikhism, in the essays in a number of them, Periyar that I mentioned, in the essay on Tagore, who writes about love and the constraints on Indian women to freely choose their partners. In a number of the other essays, I talk about issues that are relevant to women in India, even though I couldn't find, in a sense, the equal number of women and men to have in the book. But I didn't want to fall into the trap of a kind of false representativeness, where, you know, if you've got X number numerically there, you've dealt with the issue of inclusion. I wanted to show how you can draw these different figures and talk about issues through different lives and dramatize some of the constraints. So that was the way that I tried to be representative about it, rather than saying I had to have 5 from the north, 5 from the south, you know, 5 from this bit, etc. Because I think that would have really produced a much more artificial and stilted account.
Thank you for coming today. 100 years from now, when someone writes the sequel to your book, who will be in that book?
Wow. This is where kind of people who are essentially historians go off the air. Let the future decide. I mean, I think that there are things that one can say about India today which would give a hint at who those figures might be. For instance, you know, one of the things we're seeing, quite a few of the figures I draw on, by no means the majority, but quite a few are political figures linked with rulers and leaders. I think one of the things you're seeing in India today is the huge sort of explosion of civil society. And the way in which some of the most interesting and powerful individual voices in India come from social movements or what we call NGOs, whether it's environmental movements or movements for tribal rights and so forth. And so I think, you know, some of those figures, some of the people who've been fighting against the displacement of people for building dams and so forth, those kind of figures would probably figure in a remake of this in 100 years' time. I think also you would be able to draw many more people from the economic world, the world of the economy and entrepreneurship, as that sphere of Indian life really now starts to kick into action. There definitely would be more figures drawn from that world. I also think you would see more people from the world of arts and the sort of cultural activities, because again, that now after India has now essentially been an open society for almost 70 years, and the combination of economic growth and the openness of the society is really starting to create a very interesting explosion of cultural inventiveness and innovation. So I think artists, filmmakers, people working in the digital world, those sorts of figures would also appear in the next batch when it's written. So, without wanting to name particular individuals, because it's too early to judge, those are the areas that I would be looking at. Possibly sports. India's not been a great performer in sports, but maybe over the next 100 years, that will, maybe India will finally win an individual gold medal at the Olympics. India celebrated this year when a bronze was won. But that may be an expanding area of kind of talent in India. So those would be broadly the areas.
Hi, thanks. So seeing the book there, I was interested in wondering, I have some friends who like me, grew up in the States, but their families are from other parts of the subcontinent, from like Bangladesh and Pakistan. I'm wondering if there's a good frame for them to read the book as well, if for sort of common parts of history or things like that. Like, do you think there is a way that people from the background also appreciate parts of the book?
Sure. Well, so the way I've thought about it in the book is that the term India prior to 1947 I've used to refer to the entire subcontinent. There's a map in the book which doesn't have really national borders in it. It's broadly the Indian subcontinent, and in that I've sort of located where the birthplaces were of many of these figures. So I draw, for pre-1947, I draw figures that are taken from all across the subcontinent. So for instance, apart from several of the figures of the Mughal period, I talk about Iqbal, a great poet of the early 20th century, who was both the author of some of the best-loved patriotic songs that are sung in India today, but is also considered the national poet of Pakistan. He wrote in Urdu and in Persian and in Arabic. So I have a whole essay on Iqbal and how he thought about the position of Muslims in India and in a future independent India. I also have an essay on Jinnah, who is the founder of Pakistan, but in many ways you could say is central to Indian history for all but 1 year of his life. He dies in 1948. So I've tried to and similarly, Tagore, if you like, was born in what's now Bangladesh in East Bengal. He is the only person we know of, or I know of, who is the author of the national anthems of two different nations, India and Bangladesh. So, I've tried to certainly to draw figures beyond national boundaries for the pre-1947 period, but after 1947, I have really focused on the national boundaries of India as a nation. So that's really the way I've tried to address that issue, which is a complex one. As I said at the beginning, I mean, this is a nation constructed on a modern nation constructed on what's a larger and much deeper and older civilization. Sure.
This is a larger question than just this book, actually. I'm curious how writers like yourself are dealing with history that's, pretty contentious, especially in modern times, figure out what kind of provocation to actually introduce in the book and which to keep off of. How do you make this decision? If you go to a literary festival, would there be pickets and people protesting based on something you've said versus things you actually want to introduce and create a provocation? Like, how do you walk that line?
Yeah. Again, it's a really, really important issue in pretty much any kind of writing in India today, which is liable to provoke opposition or offense. I mean, India is, I talked about it being a great democracy. It's also, there's a great democratization of offense. So everyone can feel offended and will make their views known. I mean, I guess, there are sort of two reasons that led me to write this book. One was that I thought in India we were in some ways over-invested in our history, in the sense that we tended to see it as legend and myth rather than as it actually happened. And on the other hand, in the West, there's a kind of underinvestment in Indian history. There's just not very much knowledge about it. So it is a question of striking a balance, as you said, between being sort of cool-headed and explanatory and true to the facts, but also wanting to be part of and nudge along an argument that's going on in India about some of these figures. And a lot of the figures I talk about are very controversial. I mean, they're figures who, people have very strong and passionate feelings about. But so how I try to address it was not to be willfully iconoclastic. I don't really see that as being a particularly useful way of thinking about these figures, but to be to question and rethink some of the presuppositions we have about some of these great figures in the Indian past, to see them for the remarkable people they are, but also to say, look, at the end of the day, these are human beings. These are not myths. These are not legends. These are not comic book characters. And indeed, if you see them as human beings, that's exactly what makes their achievements all the more remarkable, that they were fallible. They could make mistakes, but they were still able to do what they did. So, that's really when I say I want to demythologize in order to rehumanize, to get my own fellow citizens in India to recognize that, we don't have to wrap these figures up in this burnished veneer of greatness. We just need to see them as real human beings, and that will be enough to recognize how extraordinary they were, but also to give us and to give young Indians today something to engage with and inspire them, rather than to treat them as these mythic beings. Great. Thank you. Thanks very much.